Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Julian Grace, and today's deep dive conversation is with WRAL education reporter Emily Walkenhorst, and she's here to talk about the latest National Assessment for Educational Progress report known as the Nation's Report Card. So why does this report matter? It matters because it shows North Carolina 4th and 8th grade students scoring worse on math and reading exams this spring than before the pandemic. Emily, did the findings in that report come as a surprise to districts across the state?
They did not. And we talked to DPI, we talked to Michael Maher, who is the director of the Office of Learning, Recovery, and Accountability, and he said they're instructive, but they're not surprising. You know, we had state test scores that came out September 1st, and they were down from 2019. We've already kind of had an indicator that things were worse. But looking at these national scores, you really can see how much worse it was for everybody. And it is a different type of test. It's a little bit more rigorous than a lot of state tests nationwide. I don't know exactly how it stacks up to North Carolina, but basically it just wasn't surprising. We knew that remote learning and stresses caused by the pandemic had contributed to a slowed learning, and they've picked up a little bit from, where they were last spring. So, they've done some accelerated learning. And so that's one thing you can't see in the data is there's a 3-year difference between when the tests were taken. And so there was a slide, but then perhaps there's been a recovery in the last year. It's just not as much as they needed to get back to the 2019 levels.
How soon could we see that recovery?
So the state has estimated, I believe a few months ago, they said they think it might be about 4 years.
4 years?
Yeah.
You touched on learning loss. What are some of the key contributors to the low scores in math and reading? Is it solely the pandemic?
So there's been some research on math scores. There was a math assessment that was done several months ago, and some researchers compared results of that to which school systems had been remote for however many months or longer. And they found that there was a correlation, and they believed they had done an analysis to say there was causation as well, that the school systems that were remote for longer did worse, and it was because they had been doing remote learning.
Wow. The report also says that right now North Carolina schools remain on par with national performance. How do you assess that? Is that a good thing, a bad thing?
So that's not unusual for North Carolina. North Carolina is about average compared to the nation. According to its neighbors, North Carolina is on par with some of our neighboring states as well. Did a little bit better than South Carolina in math, and not quite as good as Virginia in math. And that seems to be fairly normal. So I think what we can extrapolate from that is everybody just did worse for the most part.
What are you hearing from parents right now?
So a lot of parents, I think they're worried, especially if you were a parent of a student who didn't have 4 more years to catch up, you might be worried, maybe whether they'd graduate on time, or if your child wanted to go to college, how prepared would they be to go to college? Would they need to take some remedial coursework once they were actually there? Things like that. And then of younger kids, obviously you want to make sure they can socialize. I think that's a big part of the remote learning is really not even about test scores, but especially for kids is, the exposure to socializing, plays a big role in their development. And, I heard at a Wake County school board meeting on Monday, there was a board member who was saying there are a lot of parents who, even if their kids did do well on a test, don't want their kids to move up to the next grade level because they're worried their kid just isn't mature enough to, to be at that grade level. And so there are a lot of concerns about maturity, and things that really aren't even academic. But then also, of course, you want to make sure your child, is mastering math and reading. And, if you want them to progress to the next grade level, you would want to make sure that academically that would suit them as well.
This assessment, is it placing more pressure on teachers right now?
I think there is a lot of pressure on educators right now. And, I think a lot of that came with, really started in the pandemic. It started ramping up. I think teachers have been feeling pressure for years before that because of such an emphasis on standardized tests. But, during the pandemic, teachers were asked to switch to remote. And I think a lot of teachers felt like they were working more hours. They were adjusting to teaching in a way they had never taught before. And dealing with maybe just a lot of technology issues they wouldn't have had to deal with in a normal school day. So some of the work wasn't actually even academic for them. And then now that they've returned to the classroom, maybe teachers had to, spend some time cleaning their class, or they had to make sure kids were wearing masks back when masks were still required. And they had to do a lot of things. And then, students might be struggling because the pandemic itself is stressing them out, or having been remote for the last several months was also stressing them out. And so, they're having to deal with kids who are just not as okay, perhaps, as they were before. And then on top of that, there's so much concern about getting kids back on track academically that, teachers feel a lot of strain and a lot of pressure to get students back on track academically, and to also just meet some of their more emotional or social needs. And then, on top of that, the state has begun a new reading program that teachers are being trained on for the next couple of years. And it's several dozen of professional development hours each year. And so a lot of teachers are doing that on the weekends in their own time.
There's so many different factors. Let's take a break right here. We'll be back after the break with WRAL education reporter Emily Walkenhorst. And when we come back, let's talk about possible solutions to get test scores back up. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm talking with WRAL education reporter Emily Walkenhorst as we look at recent national assessments that show 4th and 8th grade students in North Carolina are scoring worse in math and reading exams this spring than before the pandemic. Emily, what is the solution?
So there are a lot of solutions. And what path you take is going to depend a little bit on your resources. So schools have a lot of COVID, like federal pandemic stimulus money. North Carolina got about $5 to $6 billion for that, and a lot of that's already been spent. They had to, they bought Chromebooks, they bought all kinds of supplies, and hired a lot of other staff. So one thing that schools are doing is they're trying to hire more like learning intervention type coaches. They're trying to add staff who can, do some of that intervening and make more individualized plans for some students. Of course, that's going to depend on your ability to hire for some of those positions. So we've heard from school districts they've been able to hire for some of those positions, maybe not all of those positions. Maybe some schools have been more successful than others. And so that's one way. And, other ways include high dosage tutoring. So high dosage tutoring is basically a few sessions a week at about the same time for at least 30 minutes each with no more than 1 to 3 students. And so they're doing this a lot with reading, basically picking kids who are really struggling with reading at a younger grade level. And then they have a set of goals where they consider the tutoring done when the student has reached a certain point, basically getting onto the track they really need to be on grade level. And then once they're done with that student, they'll rotate in and they'll do some more students. And so there is kind of like a waiting time, so some students may not have gotten high dosage tutoring when it was available last year because other students were receiving it, but maybe they'll be able to receive it this year. But that also depends on staff. So North Carolina Education Corps is doing paid tutors that's funded by the state. And in Wake County, they're using a lot of those tutors, but then they also started a volunteer program called Wake Together, and that's with some different groups, including the YMCA. And that uses volunteer tutors to provide the same thing. I believe they also do some higher grade levels, maybe like up to 5th grade, and maybe some math tutoring. So that's a very like personnel intensive type intervention. And, if the staff is available, if the volunteers are available to do it.
I like that you said that, if the staff or volunteers are available. We've talked before about teacher burnout. How do districts operate bringing in or finding those qualified teachers and volunteers without burning them out?
So a lot of them are not teachers. So some of them are people who perhaps they're retired teachers, or they're other people who are retired from other professions, but they just want to help out, or they are people who are they're considering a career in education. Maybe they're 18, 19 years old, and they just want to get a little bit of experience with it and see if it's really the right path for them. So it's really going to be a mix of people who want to sign up for it. And when I was talking with Michael Maher at DPI, he had said, that's a great tutoring program if you can't get the staff. He recommends maybe doing, some kind of online tutoring. Maybe it's a tutor who is in, Virginia or Texas, or, just not in North Carolina, but they're through an online company. But he said it really should still be that high dosage. It should be the same tutor and the same student every time on a regular schedule, ideally during the school day, because a lot of before and after school tutoring isn't necessarily something that can fit in everybody's schedule. It might end up not being regular, and it might be that a different tutor works with different students, and you don't necessarily have that regular intervention with the same adult who's really trying to get the student back on track.
So let's get them while they're here.
Yes.
I know you've looked over this assessment, and reading it and going through it, it can be rather discouraging. Did you find any bright spots or any source of encouragement when you were looking at the numbers from the assessment?
So we had a call with U.S. Department of Education officials, and they kept noting that there were bright spots. They said, I believe the education secretary said the results were appalling, but other members of the Department of Education just kept emphasizing that there were bright spots that perhaps we can learn from, that a lot of the urban school districts, so there's there are state results, and then there are urban school district results. And they're reported and collected differently, but basically the urban school systems have voluntarily decided to have more students be sampled for this test. And what showed up in some of those school districts is that some of their test scores did not drop. A lot fewer of them had any kind of statistically significant change in some of their 8th grade reading scores compared to some of the states. So they were saying there's something some of these city school districts are doing that might be working better than perhaps some of the other school districts that had students who took this test. And so there were some gains. The Los Angeles Unified School District had a huge gain in 8th grade reading, I believe. And so, they're saying, what can we learn from Los Angeles? What did they do to keep students from not only losing ground, but students actually gained ground? And so they want to look to some of those examples of what did some of those school districts do that helped students not have the same slide.
Have we heard what Los Angeles is doing?
I have not looked into that. I trust the Los Angeles Times to look into that.
I appreciate that. Well, Emily, thanks for joining us today, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. You can also listen to entire WRAL newscasts in podcast form. Find WRAL Newscast in your podcast app. The feed is updated with new newscasts multiple times per day.